Welcome to today's webinar, Perfect City, Lessons, Challenges, and Pitfalls of the World's Greatest Cities, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning on behalf of the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I am Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org. Log into your account and search for the name of today's event, which is Perfect City, Lessons, Challenges, and Pitfalls of the World's Greatest Cities. You can also search for event number 9190716. So to get started, our speaker today is Joe Berridge. Joe is an urban planner and city builder who has had an integral role in the development of complex urban planning and regeneration projects in Canada, the US, the UK, Europe, and Asia. As a partner at Urban Strategies Incorporated in Toronto, over the past 30 years, Joe has been a strategic advisor for the development of the city centers of Manchester, Belfast, and Cardiff, and for the waterfronts of Toronto, Singapore, Sydney, Cork, London, and Governor's Island in New York City. He has prepared campus master plans for the University of Manchester and Waterloo, Queens and Western in Canada, and is now planning the new hub for the Toronto Pearson International Airport. Joe teaches at the University of Toronto and is a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Joe's first book, Perfect City, was published by Sutherland House in April 2019. Due to technical difficulties, we were not able to record the first 5 minutes of Joe's presentation. However, we have included the slides that you can follow along, and we'll pick up where the recording begins.
Of that emphasis on human capital, fewer and fewer cities are getting more and more important. It's as if the magnetism of cities is increasing. So it's drawing more and more of the educated, technologically sophisticated population to the city. And as a result, the hinterlands of the United States, of Canada, of the UK, some extent of Europe, are getting starved of that critical human capital. This translates into a whole bunch of competitions that cities have. If there are only perhaps a couple of dozen cities that really are the fulcrum of the modern economy, there's a big question about what one does if one doesn't happen to be one of those cities. What's clear right now is that of the elements that contribute to that spikiness, financial services is still very much the dominant driver. The financial services industry has a very big multiplier effect. It used to be, I think that people estimated that an auto plant, every job in the auto plant would create 5 or 6 other jobs in the surrounding community of parts suppliers and other service suppliers. It looks as if financial services is significantly over that, with a multiplier in the order of 6 to 7. Who are these people that it brings along? Lawyers, accountants, management consultants, all kinds of advisors, and then at the next tier, all of the design and communications professions, the media professions, and then of course at the next tier, the restaurants, cultural and other providers. Financial services people tend to be paid very well, a bit offensive to us planners, no doubt, but they certainly do have that very big spread effect. What's happened to financial services is that it really has begun to concentrate in very few places. It used to be that in the United States, Hartford, Connecticut had a significant role in insurance. In Canada, London, Ontario. In the UK, Liverpool. In France, Lyon. Those cities have tended to shrink in relative importance. And though there's been an enormous concentration of financial activity into very few cities. And basically here again is the list. London, New York, and Hong Kong up at the top. But with Singapore, Tokyo, Shanghai, and further down the list, Beijing, reflecting that really important Asian presence that clearly is going to be dominating the next part of this century. This is very similar to the list of the ranking of rankings world cities, again reflecting the fact that, in a sense, whether we like it or not, financial services have tended to be the attractor of so many other human skills and talent. The next thing that's fascinating to look at, and again, Richard Florida has been very much influenced my thinking on this. We're looking here at, believe it or not, an airport. This is Terminal 5 Changi, Singapore. It gives you some idea of what on earth is going on in the rest of the world in terms of airports, because airports are extraordinarily important in terms of their role in urban success, and again, their role in contributing to spikiness. What's happening is that fewer and fewer airports are becoming more and more important because they are becoming the providers of global connectivity. So what you're seeing in front of you now is that connectivity ranking. And basically that is saying to how many places in the world can you fly nonstop from London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Chicago, Toronto, Singapore, etc. And why is that important? Because in a globalized world, the more destinations like that you can pick up, the more successful your city is going to be. We have a business that works all over the world. We're not very big. We're about 80 people. And I know that in Canada, the only place that we could work out of would be Toronto, because Toronto, as you can see there, is a pretty well connected place. It is tricky for second-tier cities to have global span and global connectivity. And this, again, is why, in terms of city building and economic development activity, it's really critically important that cities pay attention to the management of their airports and try and boost their ability to connect to other cities. I've had the pleasure of working in St. Louis over the years, and one of the things that I think that has been problematic for St. Louis is the loss of TWA, the loss of that hub quality character that contributed so much to its previous economic success. Again, it's not fair, but it is seemingly the way in which the major urban economy is sorting itself out, is that fewer and fewer places are having this power and connectivity. The interesting question that arises from that is, what do you do if you are a second-tier city? Certainly it's one of the things that we have been spending a lot of time thinking about in Toronto, which has been growing very, very quickly, and the rest of the country has not been growing nearly as quickly. What is critical, therefore, is that you make sure that your big hub city is as well connected to the secondary cities as it possibly can be, and that those secondary cities recognize their competitive advantage in having that connectivity. It's fascinating working in London, England, where London is one of the highest priced places to do business, to afford housing, and those negative characteristics of cities at the top of the spike have their effect. What's going on in London is essentially that a second ring of cities around London, Reading or Brighton, are beginning to benefit from a different cost package while still having the advantage of being close to the major city. What's fascinating now is that as the UK is improving the quality of its rail network, electrifying lines and taking times out of distance, that a lot of cities which used to be 2 hours away are now 1 to 1.5 hours away, like Bristol, Bath, and Cardiff. And they have been benefiting big time from basically being able to provide a much lower cost base of office rental, of housing, and thus lower labor cost, while still being able to reasonably quickly connect to all the benefits of the big city at the top of the spike. You can see that happening in London. You can see that happening around New York, where the cluster of cities like Newark, White Plains, Bridgeport, which used to essentially export labor out to New York City proper, are now, I think, all three are net importers of jobs, and that shows the fact that if you position yourself as in the kind of solar system of a major city, if you position yourself correctly, you actually can get the benefits and perhaps avoid the disbenefits of big city living. What's fascinating is also to look at what the rate of growth of airports is. You are looking at here the extraordinary rate of growth of Toronto Pearson and Los Angeles, which interestingly is greater than Dubai, Beijing, or any of the other Western country airports. It's fascinating to ask why it is that those two, Toronto and Los Angeles, are at the top of the rate of growth. Yes, it's partly having to do with their business success, but it's also having to do with the fact that both Toronto and Los Angeles are very much immigrant cities. We'll get to this later on, but Toronto is almost 50% not born in the country. Los Angeles is probably in the high 30s not born in the country. And what that means is that just the pure human activity of going back to visit relatives, of all of those family connections, provides a kind of base demand for air travel that business travel can then sit on top of. It's one of the unrecognized benefits of being a strongly immigrant city, is that you can essentially use the network of those immigrants to support the network for business people. The next, so we've talked about the financial services as absolutely key driver. We've talked about airports and airport connectivity as absolutely key driver. Clearly, high quality education is an absolutely essential fundament on which modern urban success rests. It is the fundamental platform, basically because the modern economy consists of activities that require extremely well-trained people. The other thing that's very interesting, and that's why all universities pay enormous attention to the various rankings as they come up from the two big ranking agencies, the Times Higher Education Index and the Shanghai Quanzhou Index. Why is it important to be up those rankings? Because essentially education has become very much a commodity that major successful cities sell. It's one of the key ways in which immigrants are attracted, high quality immigrants are attracted to a city, is because that's where they know they're going to get an extremely good and therefore extremely competitive and therefore extremely sellable educational base. So the modern city really has to pay a lot of attention to make sure that its universities are strongly competitive. Because essentially the key process that's going on in the modern city is the turning of those high quality brains into business opportunities. This is a picture here of the Singapore Biopolis. It's this extraordinary campus of a kind of a very diverse tech center that sits next to the National University of Singapore, which is a top 20 ranked university. And it consists of Biopolis, which is the pharma business incubator, Nanopolis, which is the nanotechnology business animator, Fusionopolis, which is the materials science business opportunity explorer, Digitopolis, Mediaopolis. What they are doing on this, and I strongly recommend it to any planner should go and see this complex, because it really makes you understand what the engine of growth of the modern city is. About half a dozen years ago, we were lucky enough to win a very big master planning competition in Singapore to plan the expansion of their downtown into what was then the container port on the waterside. And after we'd won this competition, the magnificent lady, Dr. Chung, who runs the kind of the urban side of Singapore. Singapore is a city state of about 6.5 million people. And she said to us, well done. You've won the master plan competition, but now I've got to explain something to you. I've got to explain Singapore 101. We have no oil, we have no gas, we have no minerals, we have no resources, we have no agriculture, and essentially we have no water either. She said, but what we have, all we have is brains. And the job of the city of Singapore is to turn those brains into business. And that's true, you realize, for every city. No city has oil, or very few have oil and gas and resources and minerals, etc. But what they do have is human capital. And the way in which that human capital is translated into brains, those brains into business, is the key process of the modern city. This is the medical and related sciences discovery district in Toronto, doing exactly that. This is Cornell Science University. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. This is in New York City on Roosevelt Island. Mayor Bloomberg is agonizing after the Wall Street crash of 2008, 2009 about the fact that the city is too dependent upon Wall Street and doesn't have a big enough tech sector. So I think what frankly is perhaps the most impressive piece of urban economic development I'm aware of, he put out a call for tech universities to come and locate in New York City. He sweetened the pot with $100 million and with a free site. And he got Cornell, along with Technion University of Haifa in Israel, to put together this complex for Roosevelt Island. Interestingly, he issued that call in 2011, and incredibly, the first students walked in 2017. That is 6-7 years. That, as we all know, is warp speed in economic development. So it's not just what he did, but how quickly he did it that is so admirable. London, England, Imperial College, probably one of Europe's top-ranked technical universities, has done the same thing with what's called the White City Complex in West London. And one of the more fascinating things, if you need yet another reason to go to Paris, this is an old goods yard from a railway station, the back of the Gare d'Austerlitz on the Rive Gauche in Paris. This complex, which is probably about 500,000 square feet, produces more patents than any other building in Europe. So the Europeans are no slouch in this trick of turning brains into business as well. And that, in terms of city building, is the absolute fundamental engine to which we all have to pay attention. You then go to look at the individual cities that I've been lucky enough to work in, and I talked earlier about Singapore and its ability to invent absolutely everything anew. One of the things that is really troubling about the contemporary city is how hard it is to actually do anything. We all have wonderful ideas, but actually getting those ideas realized and built seems to be eluding us. There was an extraordinary article in the New York Times just yesterday about the 50 years of not improving Penn Central Station in New York City, and all of the reasons why that wasn't happening. So it's very refreshing to go to places like Singapore, which they have the great benefit of being a city-state, which probably secretly all cities would like to be. But here's one in practice. So what you're looking at here is an incredible park, Marina Bay Park. And these are artificial palm trees, which are actually also walkways and restaurants. And they are the flume towers for the anaerobic digestion that's going on underneath them. So stuff like this rocks you away from the normal way of thinking about how a city should be built. The other reality, as I was saying before, is that nothing can happen without infrastructure. This is a picture of Shanghai, Pudong, in 1992, I think, and that's 1994, and this is a picture of it today. What Shanghai had decided is that those beautiful buildings that you can see in the foreground, what's called the Bunt, the lovely heritage buildings, that whole fabric on that side of the Huangpu River was too delicate to be able to absorb the energy of a new financial center. So they planned a whole financial center across the river on what were previously paddy fields. At the same time, in 1993, they started building their first subway station, a subway line. They now have the biggest subway line in the world, and subway system in the world, bigger than New York City. So that is basically in about 25 years, they have gone from nowhere to the biggest in the world. It's a big challenge for all of us in more developed world, Western cities, to recognize the vigor and energy and, frankly, engineering, innovation, and competence that Asian cities are showing. And it's to our fault, frankly, that we seem to find it very hard to respond. So that's Pudong 2014. Another city that I spend a lot of time on, which is a fascinating city, is Manchester, England. And I've been lucky enough to work there a lot. A lot of you may know about Manchester because it has two magnificent football teams, Manchester City and Manchester United. But it also is a fascinating city because at the end of the 19th century, it probably was one of the most important cities in the world. It was the place where everything was invented in terms of new machinery, in terms of new textile processes, electrical manufacturing processes. It was an incredibly powerful city and ran for like that probably for almost a century until after the Second World War, it collapsed very quickly. What's interesting about, so essentially it was the Detroit of the UK. What's interesting is that the city leadership, there's a culture in Manchester which is extraordinarily powerful about making sure that government and business, city government and local business people essentially work together very closely. There's a whole tradition of doing that. What you're looking at here are the docks that connect out to the Atlantic, bypassing Liverpool, which is a very clever move in the 19th century, early 20th century. In this century, what Manchester has done is to go very heavy on media, very heavy on culture, very heavy on sports, very heavy on airport, which it owns the municipal airport, and it's used all of those building blocks to essentially become very much the second economic city of the United Kingdom. So what that's, and it's not the biggest place in the world, it's only about 4 million people in total, but what that suggests is that the trick of having government, city government and business work very closely together on the economic fundamentals of a city is something that a lot of other cities could learn from. Another place that I talk about a lot that was one of the most fascinating places in which I worked was Belfast in Northern Ireland. Belfast, you're looking at the city center here, is a very old city, a very long established city, but a city that was absolutely riven by religious and what you might call ethnic strife, which broke out in the 70s into actually a civil war. So Belfast had a war going on inside it for 20 years. 3,000 people were killed, about 15,000 people were injured, and this is in a city of 500,000 people. What is extraordinary and what I was very moved by when working there was the determination in the last decade and this decade to make peace, to essentially create a city in which people could live harmoniously together. And it was fascinating because that's really what cities are all about. Cities are places where diverse people learn to live together successfully. What's also fascinating is that on my working committee, I had representatives from all the political parties, from the Catholic, Protestant, Unionist, all of these tribes. They couldn't agree on anything politically, but they could all agree on what urban design improvements were necessary along the river, where the little parking lot that you see in the bottom right-hand corner there should be turned into a park, how they could create complete streets and make those bridges more interesting, where they should be planting trees. So you realize that there's an agenda in cities that is actually very unifying. And it's very moving to see a city so striven by strife to be able to move in that direction. Because this is essentially I've talked a lot earlier about the economic power of cities, which is the fundamental. You can't have a city unless you have an urban economy. And I think, frankly, if I can make a criticism of us as planners, we've paid far too little attention to the importance of the economy. We've paid perhaps too much attention to the city as the physical object rather than as the wealth creating, job creating object. But it is really important. Cities are places, they're not just machines, they're places where we live. So when you start to look at the livable cities index, and this is from the Economist magazine, what's fascinating about this is that you get a very different list. There are only a couple of cities, Sydney, Toronto, and Tokyo, on the list that were in that previous dozen that you saw in terms of the world's most economically powerful cities. And I think this is telling us a very fascinating message. If you look at where the most livable cities are, they're essentially in what you might call the Commonwealth, the old British Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and they are in the Nordic cities, Copenhagen, and cities like Stockholm and Amsterdam. So the trick, I think, the sweet spot for any city is to try and get yourself on both lists. You've both got to be a livable place and you've got to be an economically viable place. Why do you have to be a livable place? Because remember, all the key ingredient of the modern city is brains. Brains live in people. People want to live in nice places. And so the focus on livability is absolutely fundamental to urban success. By the same token, I think we have to worry a lot about what I call the soft city, as opposed to the hard city. What we're looking at here is one of those pencil buildings in New York City that somehow got away from all of us planners. This is kind of a little zoning trick that some clever people found about how to build super tall buildings where they weren't allowed before. And these have popped up, 3 or 4 of these in Manhattan. I personally find these very offensive buildings because essentially what's going on there is there's one apartment, 1 or 2 apartments a floor, and for the most time they're vacant. They're lived in or owned by oligarchs and plutocrats from disreputable places, and essentially these are people who play no role in the city as a place, as an urban culture. I think we have to be very alert to the dangers of income inequality because they have a very souring effect on the very people that we know are absolutely fundamental to make the city work and be a success. What do we have to pay attention to in contradiction to housing the uber wealthy? There's a lovely phrase actually, which is in the constitution of nearly all those Commonwealth countries like Australia and New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada, and that is peace, order, and good government. It's the equivalent of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the American Constitution, or liberté, égalité, fraternité in the French Constitution. And that does mean something about the way we organize our urban life. Good publicly accessible schools are absolutely fundamental. You really must pay attention to ensuring that every kid leaves a public school with good reading and good writing abilities. Because if the city depends on its human capital, that human capital is essentially formed in the last couple of years of public school. So again, as city planners, we tend not to bother ourselves with these kinds of public services. But if we want to make sure that the cities are the livable, harmonious, economically successful places we want, we better pay attention to that. By the same token, the power of libraries. One of the things I do in Perfect City is to go to libraries in a whole bunch of different cities around the world. There are very few cities that understand what the power of libraries really is. If you're an immigrant society, new people coming to your city are really lost. The library can provide them a digital information home that's free. So what can you do from a library? If it's properly set up, you can have free Wi-Fi. You can connect with the rest of the world, with your family back wherever they might be. You can read the newspaper from the city that you just came from. But also you can get essential information about the society that you've just come to. Behind the welcome desk at any Toronto library, there's a big list which says, if you are a newcomer to Canada, here's how you can get a health card, get a social insurance number, get your kid registered in school, get a driver's license, get the immunization shot that you need to get your kid registered in school, the people you can go to see if you're having trouble with your landlord. All of that is right behind, as I say, the welcome desk in the library. This is a fantastically useful way of simply and for free welcoming newcomers into your city. By the same time, you need to make sure that your parks and public spaces work successfully. That should be great, not GEET, parks and public spaces there. These are the places where, again, people meet informally. And if you want to have a city that isn't tribal, that isn't segregated, you've got to provide these harmonious meeting spaces. And parks and public spaces and streets are the places where essentially that community comes together and is founded. I think what a lot of people underestimate is quite what the power of immigration is in the modern city. I think it's arguable to say that you can't have a successful city unless you have a very powerful stream of immigration. You saw that earlier in terms of the unintended effects with respect to airports. The fact that immigrants, because they are in a sense inherent travelers, tend to make your city more connected even for business folk. When you look at why immigration is so important, frankly, it's because those immigrants are the people. I'll just go back on here. Those immigrants, the very act of immigration is a very courageous thing to do. Only a small fraction of people from the rest of the world immigrate to our great cities, and they are self-chosen, self-selected fraction. And it's that very determination and drive and self-identification and risk taker as an immigrant that actually brings the value added of human capital to a city. It's fascinating in Toronto, which is now approaching half of its residents not born in the country, half of its residents being immigrants, that the children of immigrants at school and in later life outcomes tend to do slightly better than the folks who were there in the first place. And that reflects two things. One is it reflects the fact that the determination and drive of their parents, but also the fact that the education system, the library system, the public space system is set up for success for those generations of new immigrants. It's also important because size matters. Toronto accepts 125,000 new immigrants a year, just by way of comparison. I think New York City is about 35,000, London, England is about 20,000, Paris is about 20,000, Los Angeles is about 40,000, Miami 40,000. So Toronto is 3 or 4 times has 3 or 4 times the number of immigrants coming to it. That has a huge effect. Size matters in cities. This is a picture of Toronto in the year 2000, the downtown. That's a picture in the year, this is the built and approved projects running forward a couple of years. Just to run through that again, pretty amazing. So it's kind of an obvious statement, but if you want to build your city, you need people. And those people are not going to come any longer from local residents or even from your local country. They are going to come from abroad. It's interesting to look at the Crane Index here. Toronto, I'm being a little bit of a Toronto booster here, but it's extraordinary what that stream of 125,000 new people a year has done in terms of the construction and development industry. And you can see that it's almost 3 times the closest rivals in Seattle and Los Angeles. Why is that important? Is because as city builders and as city planners, essentially you ride the wave. We're not the people who create the wave. We are the people who try and manage and direct the wave. And what is that wave? Essentially that wave is economic activity and people activity and population growth. So there are lots of techniques by which cities can make themselves immigrant friendly. Certainly that is probably the fundamental job of any city builder who wants to see their city advance. You can see here quite what's happening again in Toronto, and again driven entirely by immigration. Toronto is right now roughly the same size as Chicago. This is the metropolitan area, the kind of census metropolitan area, and it is interestingly going to pass Los Angeles by mid-century in population. So this is the trend that you can see happening in all of the big cities in the world. The biggest cities, fastest growing cities in the United States are still the biggest cities. And that goes back to that original Richard Florida idea about spikiness and concentration. So in summary, what are the drivers of the modern metropolis? Clearly, there is an importance of global cultural stature. Cities' reputation, cities' place in the world, I think contributes significantly to their attractiveness, and in a sense will run on even after perhaps the economic drivers aren't as strong as they used to be. Financial services, again, I'm never too thrilled about this conclusion, but financial services industry is probably the single most important urban industry there is. Connected airports, I hadn't appreciated, and it's interesting, Richard Florida came to the same conclusion. He never realized quite how important airports were, but his statistical analysis, he's a great man for analyzing great fields of data and coming to conclusions. He concludes that actually airports might be as important as the tech sector as a driver of the urban economy. First-ranked universities. Pay a lot of attention to your universities. They are both the direct and the indirect drivers of the modern metropolis. The tech sector, that is essentially what cities are doing for a living right now. Yes, I do think we're going to be getting some interesting tech-related manufacturing activity happening. It's fascinating. Again, in the New York Times last week, there was a very interesting article on the growing industrial sector in Brooklyn, feeding off the need to actually realize the physical product of those tech sector inventions. Aggressive infrastructure development. It is scary the degree to which cities in the developed world have lost the trick of building particularly transit infrastructure. There are a couple, Paris and London and Madrid, are actually pretty darn good at doing this, but certainly my city, Toronto, and most American cities really have lost that skill that was very much that the pinnacle of their post-war development, or the pinnacle of the Victorian city development, which is to provide the transit and other infrastructure without which the city frankly can't operate. The checks against excessive inequality, this is tricky because obviously no planner is in charge of the income tax system, but certainly I think we have to be very worried about the fact that a lot of evidence is suggesting that the gaps between rich and poor are breaking open too excessively in our cities, and we have to figure out how we build our cities and manage our cities to act against that. Good schools, good libraries, good public spaces, good public goods. Again, let's not worry so much about urban design and complete streets and bike lanes. Let's really worry about good schools, good libraries, good parks, and good public spaces. Actually, we should worry about both of them. But I don't see city planners paying the same attention to those fundamentally transformative public goods that make the human capital of the modern economy. And strong immigration for all the reasons that I suggested. So that's essentially a snapshot of what I've tried to do in Perfect City, and I would be very happy to welcome any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Joe. So we've actually loaded a poll question that Joe sent to us earlier, which we're putting on the screen now for you. And Joe, if you want to go ahead and put your webcam on as well, we'll switch to that after this during the Q&A session. So this is a quick poll for everybody. Which is the most important in the success of a big city? So we have several selections here. The first being global cultural stature and strong financial services. Second, good schools, libraries, parks, public spaces, and universities. 3, strong welcomed immigration, checks on excessive inequality. 4 is aggressive infrastructure development, and 5 is well-developed tech sector. So which is the most important in the success of a big city based on what Joe was saying here? And we'll give you a little bit to respond to that, and we'll put the responses up for Joe to see, and all of us.
Okay. Hi there.
So as you can see, good schools and libraries was 42, the global cultural stature 33%, strong welcome immigration and checks on inequality at 12, aggressive infrastructure development at 11, and well-developed tech sector only 2%.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, just as a commentary, the response is essentially, if you like, a planner's response. We as planners don't seem to be worrying about how the heck we pay for all of this, and also how we make sure that all of these current and new residents of a city have a job. And so we've tended to be, even in this city and in others, a bit hostile to the tech sector. It makes me a bit nervous because the fact is the tech sector is the biggest, highest value employer in the modern city. And we need to, I think, be much more pragmatic in our relation to the tech sector, and much more figuring out the terms on which we are going to welcome them to the city, because they are going to be the people who are going to employ all of our current and new residents.
Okay, so then we have the second question, which is really which of these is the least important. So you can see that we have, again, the same responses. So we'll put that up for a minute or so for everybody to respond. And thank you to everybody who's participating today, both by watching us and by participating in the polls. Okay, so in this case, the responses are a little bit more evened out. We see that the well-developed tech sector is the least important by 30%, the infrastructure 27%, global cultural stature 23%, strong welcome immigration 19%, and then finally 1% only for good schools, libraries, parks, public spaces.
Well, again, that's I think that conclusion is the obverse of what we saw before. Again, just the comment that I was making, that it's really, one must as a planner not just spend money, you've got to make money, your city, as a city builder. And that, I think, is what is very impressive about a lot of the New World cities, is that they understand they've had to create an economy out of nothing, in a sense. And so they understand that that economic base is what essentially will become the foundation on which all those public goods, libraries, parks, and open spaces will rest.
Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A section of this. And thank you for everybody who's been sending questions in. We've been assembling them from the audience. We'll now move into the Q&A. You can continue to submit questions as we move into the discussion. We'll answer as many as we can until 2:30. And I'm going to start with one that just came in about the poll question, actually. And that is, someone said to you, you've presented impossible choices. Joe says they're all important. What is your ranking of these?
Yeah, no, they are important. I mean, the truth is they're all important. I actually think the key driver of the modern city is actually immigration, and making sure that I think Confucius said, when he was asked what made the perfect city, he said, make local people happy and attract foreigners from afar. And I think that's still the game. Because if it's human capital that essentially is the creator of the modern economy, then you want to make sure that you have the best human capital possible, and that you have, in a sense, as many of the carriers of that human capital, that human intelligence, that economic development as possible. And so there is a great, in too many cities around the world, particularly the European cities, there is a turning away against immigration. And I think that is going to be a very dangerous thing for them, because essentially cities have always been energized and activated by people coming in from afar.
Okay. So to go to questions here, I think going back to the beginning in a way, and a comment and a question here. Comment, I like the idea of analyzing spikiness. However, could it be filtered for occupancy? In other words, the extreme spikiness in Asia may be skewed due to a large portion of the built environment being pre-built and vacant. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, I mean, it's tricky to be able to quite understand what's going on in Asia when you look at it from North American or European perspective. You take a city like Shenzhen, just north of Hong Kong, that didn't exist 25 years ago, really. I think it was started in the late 80s. And it's now a 10 to 15 million city and an incredibly important piece of Chinese economic infrastructure. So that's not a choice which we have in our Western developed world cities, but it does suggest perhaps that we shouldn't be quite so timid in our city building. There's a great big debate going on right now in a lot of cities about what's called in Toronto the yellow belt. So the areas in the official plan of low density single family housing that are colored yellow. And whether or not those should be much more open to redevelopment. I think in Seattle and some Californian cities that debate is going on right now as well. So I'm not sure if this is getting sideways around to the answering the question about spikiness, but in cities which have these extraordinary resources of developable area, of intensification, of accepting new population very close to transit and to the downtown, I think there's quite a challenge about rethinking really their role in the city.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Also, I think from earlier on, when you're talking about peripheral cities like Reading, Bristol, and White Plains, question is, what about Hamilton to Toronto? In other words, the difference between attracting residents, but also rising business activity.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hamilton, for those of you who don't know, is a city about 500,000, an older industrial city. It's, I think, 50 miles, 65 kilometers from Toronto. And it has had a difficult time in the last few decades because a lot of its steelmaking and other industry has diminished. But what's happening is that the price of housing in Toronto is getting so absurd that more and more people are looking at Hamilton as a place to live. And that is having a very beneficial effect. Our firm just opened an office there, and it's on a street which is kind of a dead retail street, but full of wonderful heritage gems. And all those heritage gems are being restored. There's a real sense of energy in Hamilton happening. What's tricky is that it's still quite a long way away by train and transit, probably an hour and a quarter, hour and a half, which for that kind of distance is crazy. It should be half an hour if in a 100-mile-an-hour train. And so one of the things that's very clear to me that particularly the Europeans have done quite well is to develop this regional, relatively high-speed train network that takes a city like Brighton, which is exactly the same distance away as, actually a little bit further away than Hamilton is from Toronto, Brighton from London, and it now has like a dozen trains every hour, and they take 55 minutes. What that means is that you suddenly attach a whole new city of substance and size to the metropolitan housing market. And all successful spiky cities are having terrible housing problems. The solution is not just to build a lot more housing, which clearly one should be doing, and building a lot more affordable housing. But the trick is actually improving connectivity with high-speed intra-city, high-speed rail that can connect those places to the city, to the metropolis, and to the airport, which is another of the key hubs of the metropolis. And Hamilton is lucky to be relatively close to Pearson Airport, has its own fine airport as well. What happens is that if the economy lives in people, lives in their intelligence and in their brains, then sooner or later the economy will move to where they live. So in other words, you're going to see first a human wave to the peripheral cities of the metropolis, but pretty soon after that, a business wave following that. And that's clearly what you're seeing in the cities around New York and the cities around London, England.
Okay, thank you. In kind of a similar vein here, in legacy cities such as Cleveland and Milwaukee, there has been talk for some time about fresh water being an asset that could help turn around the city. Can access to fresh water be a significant part of a comeback story for such cities?
I don't want to immediately react in a skeptical mode, but I'm not quite sure if it is. We have in the city I live in Toronto, we have Great Big Lake Ontario next to us. It's an incredibly valuable recreational resource. It's a wonderful source of fresh drinking water, and interestingly, it's also very cleverly a source of cooling. There's a wonderful, very, very extensive network of buildings that are connected to the water at the bottom of the lake, which is very, very cold, 3 degrees centigrade, and that is pumped around the city and acts as an incredibly good coolant. I'm not sure what the other mega uses of a large resource of fresh water would be from an urban economic development point of view.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay, so next question here. Doesn't most of this fall apart if the climate crisis isn't dealt with? Can we meet the climate challenge and grow these modern cities?
Everything is stressed by the climate challenge. My view is that a well-managed city is much more able to respond. The fact is that the human economy, the brain-powered economy, is much more compact than the extensive manufacturing economy. So that's a great advantage. If you look at polling data, which we can take or leave, but polling data would suggest, I think, that people who live in cities are more sympathetic to climate change initiatives, largely because they're not quite so dependent upon fossil fuel driven mobility as the rest of the countries are. It's also, I think, heartening to look at the efforts of organizations like C40, the 40 Cities program, which has been very successful in essentially creating a coalition, a constituency of people who are of cities that are interested in climate change action. So I think, where is climate change action going to come from? Is it going to come from the rural areas, from the lower density, smaller cities? I suspect not. I suspect it's going to come from the more educated, less car dependent populations of the major cities. Also, frankly, if you're going to get rid of the very substantial proportion of greenhouse gases that are produced by urban transportation, your best bet is in the big cities, not in the smaller ones.
Okay, kind of on a related topic here as well, and in terms of resilience and that planning that many of us do. I missed the first few minutes, but I didn't hear you speak to building resilient cities. If we are not thinking about building safe and strong cities, I do not see them remaining viable. Can you speak to where you think resilience fits in?
Yeah, I think the fundamental resilience is in community strength, in having the peaceful city, in having the welcoming city, in having the accommodating city, and having the city where an immigrant can successfully make a life. It's a city. I have or I had 2 teenage daughters. And teenage daughters, being what teenage daughters are, they used to disappear off and do their various things. I was never particularly worried about them in Toronto. But interestingly, both of them moved to cities which I won't name, but much more crime pervasive cities. And they were completely ill-equipped for the kind of protective behavior that you have to have in that kind of city. So, and that I found it was a terrible illumination to me about quite how important it is for a city to be resilient in the broadest human sense of the word, and certainly having safe cities, having cities where people can easily move around. That is one of the fundaments of resilience. I have great confidence I have more confidence in cities than in non-cities to be able to address these issues, and all the stats would suggest that cities are much more resilient than the non-urban parts of our countries. You know, we're seeing, unfortunately, this big divide in certainly the two big English-speaking countries, the United States and England, between the metropolitan elite, as so described, and the flyover states. This is a very unfortunate situation culturally for both countries to be in. But if you have to put your money on the tribe that's actually going to be able to build the climate-friendly, climate-resilient, safe, and livable city, it's actually going to have to be largely with the metropolitan elites in those big cities.
Okay. I think several folks have kind of picked up on the transportation element of what you're talking about. So another question here is, do you have a strong view on the trend of autonomous vehicles and or grocery carrying robots?
It's interesting that I probably was overly enthusiastic about autonomous vehicles back when, but it's very clear as the data is coming in that they're not going to be any kind of very rapid nirvana to urban movement problems. Robots, I have a similar nervousness about. I hate to have a situation where, I mean, realistically, if we're going to have robots on streets, they're going to have their own lane. So we don't have enough road space to have a robot lane, as well as a bike lane, as well as a pedestrian lane, as well as a vehicular lane. I don't think these are magic bullets. I think there are some interesting things that can be done in terms of autonomous movement systems. I suspect that they're going to be mostly useful in areas which are of a campus nature, so like universities. Or interestingly, I was just in Taiwan a couple of weeks ago, and I was on my first autonomous bus that was driving around the airport campus. There's a huge area at Taiwan Airport, and there it makes sense because essentially you're operating within a controlled universe. I think it'd be a long day before autonomous vehicles are able to be as, frankly, as smart as the normal pedestrian is.
Okay. Another question about another aspect of transportation that you were talking about earlier. Do you expect airports to become less of a key driver of city success as climate change necessitates reduced flying?
No, I think this is a big deal issue because clearly climate change is going to have a huge impact on air travel. But my suspicion is that air travel, the challenge for air travel, therefore, will be to change fuel, not to reduce air travel. Air travel is exploding in the world. And for all that we may want to stop that happening, I don't think it's very realistic. It's certainly when you have countries as big as China and India, I mean, it's fascinating in China. Yes, they built a huge high-speed rail network, and I was just on it this summer. I mean, it's quite incredible, whizzing around between these vast cities. But the fact is, probably more people fly when they've got distances over a couple of hours. You never get too far in planning a city if you put yourself smack in the face of what people want to do. So people, my suspicion is, are going to want to continue flying. The trick is to change the fuel to something that has far less or no negative impacts. Whether that's possible, I don't know. But there are looking to be some more encouraging signs in that department.
Okay. Switch gears a little bit here. You said that planners don't pay enough attention to economic development. In addition to your remarks about the tech sector and infrastructure, could you say more about that? What are the most important steps that planners can take?
I think planners should be understanding that the buildings that they are regulating, the non-residential buildings that they are regulating, essentially contain jobs and are expressions of the modern economy, and that they should be frankly far more favorably inclined to them perhaps than a conventional residential development. It is scary when you see a city struggling to maintain its economic performance. I'm sure we all know cities in our own lives where this is the case, and I've spent a lot of time working in northern England, where essentially you've seen an economy evaporate in about half a century. This is going to happen. There's very little you can do about it. Stopping that evaporation is my unhappy conclusion. But what you can do is essentially recognize what the fundamentals are for new job creation. And they are going to be happening very much in the tech sectors, and I think increasingly in manufacturing activities which spring out of the tech sectors. It's interesting, for example, in Manchester. Manchester has become the home of making pieces of equipment like heart valves, medical heart valves, and they need to have a really, really good airport because they ship those heart valves within a day to anywhere else in the world. There's a huge amount of intellectual content that goes into making those heart valves. And that is the kind of activity that the modern city will increasingly be engaged in.
Okay. So talking about some of the coordination aspects of this, here's a comment that you can respond to. Everything you says is important, but a big problem is that local governments don't coordinate investment across agencies, for example, schools or public space. So much opportunity is wasted by failing to reap multiple programmatic benefits for each project or dollar spent.
Yeah, I actually think the questioner is hitting on something pretty important about the governance of the modern city. It's very clear that the successful cities around the world are the well-governed cities. And typically, the successful big city tends to evolve a kind of two-tier system in which the upper level, the New York City government, or the Greater London Authority, or what's called Grand Paris in the Paris situation, or Metropolitan Madrid government. The upper level is responsible for a bunch of really important things that go right across the spectrum, and they are obviously transit, economic development, housing, but also education. And it's interesting to see how a number of cities, London, England is fascinating in this regard, have made dramatic improvements in the quality of their educational outcomes by proper management of the education system. In other words, that city recognizes that public and secondary school education is a crucial part of the economy of the city, and that you need to make sure that it is at the highest possible level. In too many cities, the education authority and the library authority and the economic development authority and the planning authority and the taxation authorities are all dissipated and under different people's control, and that's tricky, and I think that really acts against a city becoming, frankly, more like Singapore, which is that luckily a marvelously run city-state, but in a sense it's also a model for all of us. Singapore is how every city should be run, with this complete coordination of macroeconomic management, major public investments, the absolute emphasis on the public goods of open space and parks and public safety, absolute the determination to provide affordable housing for everybody. These are the challenges in every city are the same. And what's fascinating, and one of the things I tried to do in the book, is to see which cities actually understood what the governance system was that was optimal for realizing that success.
Okay, we actually teed up the next question perfectly, I think, there, which is what is the relative role of government, the private sector, and the combination of the two in the creation and enhancement of perfect cities?
Yeah, this is a tricky one because I think we've tended to see in the last half century a deliberate separation of the public sector and the private sector. And as I think I mentioned in the talk, it's fascinating to go to a city like Manchester where they don't think like that. The public sector and the private sector work together, and the public sector recognizes what the private sector's ambitions and goals are, but at the same time realizes that it is the private sector that are going to be necessary to realize the wider municipal metropolitan ambitions. So we've become, too many cities have become a kind of, I don't know what, almost like a sort of a border check and immigration control on private investment. Very elaborate review systems, very elaborate planning approval systems, very elaborate environmental review and legislation. And we can all know that why we think that is so necessary. That's why it's an extraordinary challenge when you go to Singapore and realize they have nothing. They don't have planning approvals. They don't have environmental assessments. They don't have any of the great panoply of regulation that the conventional city has. And yet, frankly, they do things at a higher standard and better in all of those regards than we do. So I think it's time for a bit of a rethink. I do a lot of play in the book in the kind of almost artificial drama and contradiction between Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses. Jane Jacobs, obviously the great urban theorist of the street and the bottom up and communities rising and economic development rising from the bottom and cooking into larger things. And Robert Moses being, in a sense, the czar, the dictator of how economic development and public improvement should happen. I think we've been caught pretty much as city planners on the Jane Jacobs side of this debate for a long, long time. And it's fascinating now to see Robert Moses beginning to rise again, certainly for the first part of his career, which was, this is a guy who built tens of thousands of units of affordable housing, and I think something like 700 parks in New York City before he did his terrible interventions of trying to build freeways very aggressively in New York neighborhoods. But before that, frankly, he was a good guy, more of a good guy than a bad guy. And I think we recognize that the power with which he was able to execute his actions is something that we have lost, and that's why, certainly in my city in Toronto, but also in New York, I know the ability to build transit at any kind of pace at the scale that we need, not just for what we have right now, but for the climate change challenge. We are absolutely not doing it, and a lot of it frankly springs back to the fact that we refuse to allow anybody in the city to have the consistent long-term power and authority necessary for the timetable it takes to get things like transit built.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Couple different ways we can go with the next question, but I'll start with this one, and it's more of a comment that you can perhaps respond to. Many communities overdo the concentration on tech, especially new business incubators. Help for new business needs to be as diverse as the people wanting to start business.
Yes, I think this whole business of how you incubate business and frankly something of which I'm not a fan at all, about how you induce business through financial incentives. This is a tricky thing. My sense has always been that the best business incubators are actually really good educational institutions. we spend a lot of time, and I've spent a lot of time talking about universities, the community college system, which is actually giving much more practical skills and is very responsive to that employer requests to them all of a sudden that they need a particular kind of digital technician or machine engineer or something like that. That's the best way. You provide the trained human capital in response to the opportunity. And yes, there's no question that there's some form of business incubators have been quite successful. And frankly, the one I showed in Paris, they're the most successful incubator in Europe. But to give Jane Jacobs her due, she used to say, you know, new ideas happen in old buildings, because the people who've got the new ideas don't have any money. They can't afford to pay the rent in a new building. And that's why they have to go on the second floor above the hamburger shop and get their business going. And there's a lot of urban wisdom in that observation.
Okay. We've gotten a few questions kind of on the regional aspect of things here. And here's one. What's the ideal role of the smaller suburban cities in contributing to the success of a metroplex? How does regional planning affect the success of that metroplex?
Yes, I think this is an increasingly important question in all the cities that I know well, because those regional centers are going to become more and more important. I think what we've seen in the last couple of decades is the deluge of the creative class into the central city. Well, they can't afford the central city anymore, and the central city is jammed. So you're going to be seeing a bit of a reverse wave happening. And those secondary suburban or metropolitan satellite centers are, I think, well poised now to pick up that turn. What do they need? First and foremost, they need to be connected to the two most important points in the metropolis. One is the financial center, and two is the airport. Those are the pieces of connectivity that are absolutely fundamental, and it's very hard for new business to get going if it doesn't have that kind of pretty easy, simple connectivity. But I think that the next thing is that what those centers can do is they can offer a lower cost environment, not just for housing, but in terms of rents. They can offer more of a lifestyle, hopefully getting away from the intensity and density and congestion of the center. So I think there is going to be those suburban centers, their time is coming. They do have to reach critical mass, however. Bigger is better than smaller in those centers. One of the most underappreciated reasons why the big cities have got bigger is that most households are two-income households, and both people in the household have to get a job. And solving the geography problem of both people having a job in different places is easier to do in the big city than it is in the smaller city, because maybe in the smaller city, one of the two can't actually get a job that meets their talents. So the big cities have tended to be, I think, so successful. It's one of the under-recognized accelerators because they do offer this great diversity of employment, which means that the two-income household, which is now the characteristic household, that they can both parties can get a well-paid job that meets their needs. So to some extent, if you're a suburban city, suburban center, you need to make sure you're big enough, you got enough diversity to be able to satisfy both those job needs.
Okay, so one of the questions specifically referenced Toronto and noting that it has a regional approach that is not common in the USA. Do you think we need to move to a more regional form of government for some of these issues?
Yes, it's not. Having said that, it's not easy to do. Clearly, the regional governments of Paris, of London, and even to some extent of New York City and certainly of cities like Madrid or Hamburg, and Singapore and Shanghai, these regional governments are serving their cities very well, because finally there is a government level which is able to deal with the big things without getting knocked off balance by local politicians whose main concerns are filling potholes and noisy parties and dogs running loose, and, which is frankly 90% of the stuff of local politics. You have to have a government which is able to deal with the long-term costs of major infrastructure building. Any major infrastructure project takes 10 years. So you have to have a government with that kind of longevity and heft to it. So having said that, it's not easy to do in my hometown of Toronto. There's been endless discussions about what form a regional government might take, but it's very hard to believe that the province, equivalent of the state, would be that interested in having a regional government of 10 million people sitting in the middle of a province that's only 16 million people. So the practical problems of regional government, almost the constitutional problems, I think in a lot of places are unovercomable. What you need to do is to section the problem down and say what you absolutely must have regional government for is the transit system. You must have regional government for the economic development system. You must have regional government, I think, for affordable housing provision, and do it, and for environmental protection. Do it in those sections rather than trying to create a whole new apparatus of comprehensive municipal government at the regional level.
Okay, and thanks for everybody who submitted the questions. We'll take a few more before we finish, and thanks, Joe, for bearing with us here today and responding to all of these.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So one of the questions that came in is relative to both transportation and regional planning. What do you think are some of the major factors preventing metropolitan areas from developing effective city and regional public transportation other than political red tape and low density in the suburbs?
I think that the transit advocates like me and frankly all planners haven't appreciated the fact that even in the best of all cities, less than half of the city population uses transit. And in Toronto, which has got a very much more developed transit system than most American cities, about a quarter of the population use transit to get to work. So you're kind of, it's like vegetarians wanting everybody else in the world to stop meat eating. Even though everybody one knows is a vegetarian, vegan, you don't recognize the fact that who you don't know. And who you don't know in the transit situation, the meat eaters, are the car drivers. The car is an incredibly flexible form of mobility. I mean, there's no reason that it, excuse me, no accident that it's been so successful. And especially going back to that earlier point about the fact that there are generally two income earners, so there are two destinations, and then there are the kids with additional school destinations. There are very few transit systems in the world that can pick up that level of movement demand. So you are in a situation where my sense is, yes, we absolutely must be as hard as we can going towards a transit system, a communal movement system, some form of transit system, experimenting a hell of a lot on all kinds of different ways of delivering that system and managing that system. Hopefully autonomous vehicles can have some role in it, because theoretically autonomous vehicles without having a driver could be a hell of a sight cheaper. Certainly, I don't think that's going to happen in any revolutionary way, but in the long term, that would be a great thing to have happen. And there's no question that the kind of algorithmic solution to the multiple mobility demands given out by a neighborhood could be solved by some new, different kind of probably smaller mass transit that takes you from these multiple trip origins and destinations to the unique destinations like the subway station or the train station. But the truth of the matter is we're still going to have a heck of a lot of people whose movement demands can only practically be met by an individuated vehicle. And so the most important thing, frankly, is to recognize that and stop those vehicles polluting. I think the most dramatic thing that any city should be doing, and you're seeing it now in Paris and in London, they're setting dates by which there will be no more greenhouse gas emitting vehicles in their cities. And I would love to see all cities doing that. I think that in a strange way, that's as important as trying to move a lot of the demand into collective transit mobility systems.
Great, thanks, Joe. Do you have time for a couple more?
Sure.
Okay. You've touched on it, but could you elaborate on what would be the first things you would do to help legacy cities such as Cleveland or St. Louis? More generally, do you think those cities realistically can be turned around in the short or medium run?
It's tricky, and I don't know. Most of my experience in this problem has been in England. And what has happened there is a city like Manchester, to a lesser extent Liverpool and Birmingham, all three of whom took a terrible dive, have been able to recreate a new economic life. Edinburgh has been a huge success, actually, and perhaps it does offer some clues for the Clevelands and the New York and the St. Louises. You have to. It's very tricky if you don't have an immigration stream. So I would spend a lot of time trying to attract new immigrants to the city. The best way to attract new immigrants to a city is through the education system, both at the university and at the college technical training level. And what happens in most of these places is that 25% or a third of the people who come to those institutions will stay, and they are the people on which the new economy of the city can be based. But it is tricky. We spent a lot of time working in Youngstown, Ohio, which shrunk by almost a half, and you need a kind of almost grim realism about the fact that is what is happening to you, and what are the things you can offer that will make you competitive in the brain economy, in the creative class economy. Lifestyle, undoubtedly. Culture, undoubtedly. Really nice places to live and good, strong communities, undoubtedly. So those kinds of things, the image of the city that you're putting out with respect to public safety, clearly St. Louis has had some difficulties in that regard, and one needs to, I think, recognize that they're not just inherently very difficult circumstances, but they are also putting out a message to the world about your city. Not easy to do, and I would never underestimate, because I've spent a lot of my life wrestling with this problem. And if I had an easy solution, I would lay it on the table. I don't. You have to recognize that you're not quite who you were, that you've got the few strong points that you've got to really push on those. Again, community, beauty, culture, cost base, yes, although cost base is not that crucial given the fact that the creative class seems to be rushing to the most expensive places on the planet.
Okay. Guess maybe this will be our last question, and it kind of gets to what you were just speaking of. Can you speak to the importance of heritage in cities? Heritage didn't factor into the key drivers we identified earlier.
Yes, I think heritage is part of sense of place, and sense of place is part of the advertisement of place. And it's very clear that in addition to eating vast quantities of kale and doing all kinds of Pilates. The creative class is very interested in a particular kind of building form, heritage buildings. And if you've got them, keep them, don't knock them down, because they have that magic kind of resonance to them that is appealing to the very people you want to have, who are the economic city builders. And I was just in a town called London, Ontario, which is a couple of hours to the west of Toronto, 500,000 people. One of those places that used to have a very, very strong financial services industry, very strong agricultural machinery and agricultural processing industries, all of which have faded away. But they've got a fantastic stock of heritage buildings from that era, which they are beginning to really reuse in creative and interesting fashion. And where is the new economy of London, Ontario going? It's going into those buildings. I'm never quite sure why, but there's something about tech guys that they don't want to be on the 48th floor of a shiny office tower on a floor plate of 30,000 square feet. They want to be in that street-related brick and beam textural world that seems to be the place where in most cities the tech industry is located.
Great. Well, with that, Joe, thank you very much for your time today and for really giving us a very engaging and thought-provoking talk.
Well, I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for having me.
Great.
And thank you, everybody, for those fine questions.
Excellent. So this will conclude our webinar, Perfect City, Lessons, Challenges, and Pitfalls of the World's Greatest Cities. I'd like to offer a big thank you to Joe for a great presentation and to all those who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org later this week. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our regular e-newsletter for details on other future webinars. Have a great day.